May 5th, 2009. A date that would forever change a quiet suburban community and shatter the illusion of safety that so many families take for granted. What started as a routine morning would quickly transform into one of the most shocking and disturbing crime scenes that seasoned investigators had ever encountered. Picture this. You're living in what appears to be the perfect American neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, children playing in front yards. The kind of place where people still wave to their neighbors and leave their doors unlocked. Where the biggest worry might be whether the kids remembered their homework or if dinner would be ready on time. But sometimes, evil hides behind the most ordinary facades. Sometimes, the person you trust most becomes the very person you should fear. And sometimes, the warning signs are literally written on the wall. This is the story of a family that seemed to have everything: a devoted mother, two young boys with bright futures ahead of them, and a father who worked in security, protecting others for a living. It's also the story of how quickly that perfect life can crumble when secrets, lies, and obsessions collide in the most devastating way possible. The morning began like countless others in Columbia, Illinois, a small community just outside St. Louis, where neighbors knew each other by name and children rode their bikes safely through quiet subdivisions. It was the kind of place where violent crime seemed impossible, where families moved to escape the dangers of city life. Christopher Coleman had left his house that morning around 5:40, heading to the gym as part of his regular routine. His wife Sherry and their two sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, were still sleeping peacefully in their beds. Or at least, that's what everyone believed at the time. By 7 in the morning, Chris was trying to reach his family by phone. When nobody answered, concern began to creep in. After all, Sherry should have been awake by then, getting the boys ready for school, going through the familiar morning rituals that define family life. What happened next would expose a web of deception so twisted and cruel that it would challenge everything this community thought they knew about the people living among them. Detective Justin Barlow lived just across the street from the Coleman family. For 5 years, he had been their neighbor, watching their children grow, exchanging pleasantries over backyard fences. When Chris called that morning, asking someone to check on his family, Barlow had no idea he was about to walk into a nightmare. The house looked normal from the outside. Nothing seemed out of place. The kind of suburban home you'd see in any middle-class neighborhood across America. But appearances, as we're about to discover, can be devastatingly deceiving. Barlow approached the front door first, peering through windows, looking for any sign of the family inside. When that revealed nothing, he made his way around to the basement area. That's when he noticed something that would prove to be crucial to understanding how this horror unfolded. A basement window was open, not just unlocked, but actually open, in a house where the family had been receiving death threats, where security should have been paramount. This detail would later raise serious questions about what really happened that night. The detective entered through the basement, making his way up the stairs toward the main floor of the house. The first thing that hit him wasn't what he saw, but what he smelled. The sharp, acrid scent of spray paint hung heavy in the air, creating an atmosphere of dread before he even understood why. As he reached the main floor and turned toward the kitchen area, Barlow encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Scrawled across the walls in red spray paint were messages that seemed torn from the darkest corners of human imagination. Words like "punished" stared back at him, written in what appeared to be the hand of someone consumed by rage and hatred. These weren't random acts of vandalism. These messages had a purpose, a meaning that would become clear as the investigation unfolded. They were meant to tell a story, to point investigators in a specific direction, to create a narrative that would explain the unspeakable acts that had taken place in this suburban home. But Detective Barlow's discovery was far from over. Following the trail of disturbing messages, he made his way upstairs to the bedrooms where the family should have been sleeping safely. What he found there would shake this small community to its core and launch one of the most intensive investigations in the region's history. The scene upstairs was one of calculated brutality, masked by an attempt to stage something else entirely. 3 lives had been taken during the night, each victim found in their own bedroom, each having met their end in the place where they should have felt most secure. Sherry Coleman, 31 years old, was discovered in the master bedroom. Her 2 young sons, Garrett and Gavin, were found in their respective rooms, their lives cut short before they had barely begun to live them. The method used to end their lives was particularly disturbing, suggesting an intimate knowledge of the victims and a level of planning that went far beyond a random act of violence. But perhaps most chilling of all were the additional messages left throughout the house. More spray-painted words that seemed designed to tell a specific story about who might have committed these acts and why. Messages that would initially lead investigators down one path, only to have the evidence eventually point in a completely different direction. The phrase, "You have paid," was found leading up the staircase, as if marking a trail toward the bedrooms where the victims lay. It was a message that suggested retribution, that these deaths were somehow justified in the mind of whoever wrote those words. As word spread through the neighborhood that morning, the peaceful suburban community of Columbia was transformed into something resembling a war zone. Police cars, ambulances, and crime scene investigators descended on what had been a quiet residential street. Neighbors emerged from their homes, many still in their pajamas, trying to understand what could have happened to the family they all knew and respected. The Coleman family had seemed to embody everything that made this community special. Chris worked in security for a prominent religious organization, providing protection for high-profile events and traveling around the world in service of his faith. Sherry was a devoted mother who had put her own career aside to focus on raising their 2 boys. Garrett and Gavin were the kind of children that made adults smile when they saw them playing in the front yard. Polite, well-mannered, always ready to help a neighbor or lend a hand with yard work, they were active in local sports, did well in school, and seemed to have unlimited potential ahead of them. This was not the kind of family that anyone would expect to become victims of such brutal violence. They were pillars of their community, respected by neighbors, and seemingly living the American dream in a place where dreams were supposed to come true safely. But as investigators would soon discover, beneath the surface of this perfect family portrait lay secrets that would shock everyone who thought they knew the Colemans. Secrets about relationships, about deception, and about a plan so methodical and cruel that it would challenge everything people believed about human nature. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on new significance. Were these murders the result of Chris's work in security? Had someone targeted his family as a way to get to the prominent religious figure he protected? Or was there something else entirely at play here? As investigators began piecing together the timeline of that horrific morning, questions started mounting faster than answers. The major case squad was called in immediately, bringing together 25 of the most experienced detectives from across the region. This wasn't just another crime scene. This was something that would test every skill they had developed over years of investigating the darkest aspects of human behavior. The house itself became a puzzle that investigators would spend weeks trying to solve. Every room told part of a story, but the pieces didn't quite fit together the way they should have. The basement window that had been left open raised immediate red flags. Here was a family that had been living under the shadow of death threats for months. Yet their home had been left vulnerable to exactly the kind of intrusion they should have been guarding against. Christopher Coleman was brought to the police station that morning, not as a suspect, but as a grieving husband and father who needed to help investigators understand what might have happened to his family. The image he presented was one of absolute devastation. A man whose world had just collapsed around him, who couldn't comprehend how such evil could have touched his loved ones. But experienced detectives know that grief can manifest in many different ways. Some people become hysterical, others withdraw completely. Some ask endless questions about what happened and how their loved ones died. Chris Coleman's reaction fell into none of these typical categories, and that began to concern the investigators who were trying to help him. During those first crucial hours of questioning, Coleman seemed oddly detached from the horror that had befallen his family. He never asked about the specific details of how his wife and children had died. He didn't demand to know what evidence had been found or what leads investigators were pursuing. For a man whose family had just been brutally murdered, his lack of curiosity struck the detectives as unusual. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the confines of Columbia, Illinois. If these murders were connected to Coleman's work in security, then the suspect pool could include anyone from around the world who might have harbored resentment against the religious organization he protected. Investigators began tracking down individuals who had sent threatening emails or made hostile comments about the ministry's work. It was painstaking detective work that involved following leads across multiple states and even international boundaries. Every person who had ever expressed anger or frustration had to be located and their whereabouts verified for the night of the murders. It was the kind of investigation that could take months or even years to complete thoroughly. But while that global search was underway, investigators were also looking more closely at the evidence found within the Coleman home itself. The spray-painted messages that had initially seemed to point toward an outsider with a grudge began revealing details that didn't quite match the narrative they appeared to tell. The handwriting analysis became a crucial component of the investigation. Experts were brought in to examine every letter, every stroke of the spray paint that had been used to create those menacing messages. What they discovered would eventually become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. Meanwhile, the community of Columbia was struggling to come to terms with the reality that such violence could occur in their peaceful neighborhood. Parents began walking their children to school instead of letting them go alone. Neighbors started locking doors that had remained open for years. The sense of security that had drawn so many families to this area was shattered in a single morning. Local churches organized prayer vigils and support groups for families who were having trouble explaining to their children how something so terrible could happen to people they knew. The psychological impact rippled through the entire community, affecting not just those who knew the Colemans personally, but anyone who had ever felt safe in their own home. As the investigation progressed, detectives began uncovering aspects of Christopher Coleman's life that painted a very different picture than the one his neighbors and community members had known. Phone records, computer files, and financial documents started revealing a complex web of relationships and motivations that had nothing to do with religious extremists or international threats. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on a different significance as investigators dug deeper into their origins. Computer forensics experts were brought in to trace the digital footprints of these threatening messages, and what they discovered would turn the entire investigation on its head. Every email, every letter, every threatening communication was subjected to the most advanced analysis available. The technology existed to trace these messages back to their source, to determine not just where they had come from, but what devices had been used to create them. The results of this analysis would prove to be absolutely devastating to the narrative that had initially seemed so obvious. As weeks turned into months, the investigation revealed layer after layer of deception that went far beyond anything investigators had initially imagined. This wasn't just a case of a family being targeted by strangers. This was something far more personal, far more calculated, and far more disturbing than anyone in Colombia could have anticipated. The perfect family that neighbors had admired was revealed to be struggling with issues that nobody outside their home had ever suspected. Financial pressures, relationship problems, and personal conflicts that had been carefully hidden behind a facade of suburban normalcy. The kind of problems that millions of families face, but that in this case had escalated to unthinkable consequences. Detective work of this magnitude requires not just technical expertise, but also the ability to understand human psychology and motivation. Investigators had to piece together not just what had happened on that terrible night, but why someone would be driven to commit such acts against people who should have been able to trust them completely. The evidence was mounting, but it was pointing in a direction that nobody had wanted to consider. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is someone you see every day, someone you trust implicitly, someone who knows your routines and your vulnerabilities better than any stranger ever could. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Tara Lynch, a woman from Florida who had claimed to be merely a friend, was actually much more than that. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls and text messages between her and Christopher Coleman. Credit card statements showed trips they had taken together. Hotel reservations painted a picture of a relationship that had been going on for months, hidden from everyone in Colombia. What made this discovery even more shocking was the connection between Tara and the Coleman family. She wasn't just some random woman that Chris had met through work. She was actually one of Sherry's old friends from high school. The ultimate betrayal was unfolding before investigators' eyes. The timeline was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence they uncovered. The affair had begun in the fall of 2008, just months before the death threats started arriving at the Coleman home. The connection between these two events was too significant to ignore. Computer forensics revealed something that would prove absolutely crucial to the case. Those threatening emails that had initially pointed investigators toward international suspects had actually originated from Christopher Coleman's own laptop. The account that had been used to send them was created using information that only someone with intimate knowledge of the Coleman family would have known. The spray paint used to write those menacing messages on the walls had been purchased at a local hardware store, and the receipt bore Christopher Coleman's signature. The same man who had reported receiving death threats had actually been the one creating them all along. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Tara Lynch had been keeping detailed records of her relationship with Coleman, including photos and videos that contradicted everything he had told investigators about the timeline of their affair. Among these photos was one that would ultimately seal Coleman's fate. A picture of the couple kissing, with a timestamp showing it had been taken weeks before Coleman claimed their relationship had even begun. When confronted with this evidence, his carefully constructed story began falling apart completely. The motive became crystal clear once investigators understood the full scope of Coleman's deception. He had been living a double life for months, promising Tara that he would divorce his wife and start a new life with her. They had even discussed wedding dates and future plans together, but there was a problem. Coleman's job with the religious ministry came with strict moral guidelines. Adultery could cost him his position and his substantial salary. He needed Sherry to be the one to file for divorce. to make it appear that the marriage had failed through no fault of his own. When Sherry discovered the affair but refused to divorce him, Coleman found himself trapped. He couldn't marry Tara without losing his job, but he couldn't continue the deception indefinitely either. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and he began planning what he believed would be the perfect solution. The death threats served multiple purposes in his scheme. They established a pattern of outside danger that would provide an obvious suspect when the murders occurred. They also gave him an excuse to install security cameras in his home, which he could later claim had malfunctioned or been tampered with. On the night of May 4th, Coleman put his plan into action. While his family slept, he methodically ended their lives, then spent time creating the crime scene that would support his story. The spray-painted messages, the open window, the missing security footage. Every detail had been calculated to point investigators away from him. The autopsy results revealed the true horror of what had happened that night. Sherry had fought for her life, sustaining injuries that indicated a violent struggle. Her 2 young sons had been killed in their beds, never having a chance to defend themselves or escape. Physical evidence on Coleman's body told the story of that final confrontation with his wife. Scratches on his arms matched the defensive wounds found on Sherry's hands. DNA evidence linked him directly to the crime scene, despite his attempts to clean up afterward. When Christopher Coleman was finally arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the community's shock was palpable. This was a man they had trusted, respected, and admired. The revelation that he had been capable of such calculated evil shattered their faith in their own judgment about human nature. The trial that followed would captivate the nation and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for deception that exists within seemingly ordinary people. The evidence presented painted a picture of a man so consumed by selfishness and obsession that he was willing to destroy everything and everyone who stood in the way of his desires. In the end, justice was served. Christopher Coleman was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the community of Columbia, for Sherry's family and friends, and for everyone who had known and loved Garrett and Gavin, no verdict could ever truly heal the wounds left behind. The writing had indeed been on the wall, but not in the way anyone had initially understood. The real message wasn't in those spray-painted threats or staged crime scene elements. It was in the pattern of lies, the web of deception, and the cold calculation that had led a father and husband to become the very monster his family should have been protected from. This case serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it lives quietly among us, wearing familiar faces and maintaining respectable facades, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The most dangerous predators are often those who know us best, who understand our vulnerabilities, and who have earned our trust through years of careful deception. The community of Columbia eventually began to heal, but they never forgot the lessons learned from this tragedy. They created memorials to honor Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, ensuring that their memory would live on long after the horror of their deaths had faded. And they remained vigilant, understanding now that safety isn't guaranteed simply by living in the right neighborhood or surrounding yourself with the right people. The writing on the wall had told a story, but it wasn't the story anyone expected to read.